I want to try to talk a little bit about the Doctrine of Discovery, because that really forms the basis for all of this. And the Doctrine of Discovery starts with this papal bull, and I really love that word. There's really a lot of papal bull that's going on here. We grant you, and that is the kings of Spain and Portugal, by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be. So this is 1852, obviously a long time before Columbus decided to get lost out there in the Atlantic. So that was their position. The Saracens really were the Muslim people. That's what they were talking about there. So we end up, of course, 1492, with this quote, discovery of the Americas. The Pope has to step in and make more bull. Okay? So this one says, with this proviso, however, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff, that none of the islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered, beyond that said line towards the west and south, be in actual possession of any Christian king or prince. What was happening here is the Spanish and the Portuguese were in a position where they might start fighting each other over who gets to kill all the pagan people and dispossess them of their land. So the Pope steps in and says, okay, no fighting amongst ourselves. He drew the line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean from the North Pole to the South Pole and said the Spanish get everything on the west, the Portuguese get everything on the east. So it was, this age of discovery is now being modified. It's, in my mind, and I hope to convince other people of this too, it's not so much that you get to discover these people and do whatever you want with them. It's really only one European power gets to screw with these people. That's the important part of what's going on here. So let's see what the else was. All right, so we're jumping ahead a couple of centuries here. The pageant of Saint Lassan and Sault Ste. Marie. My 10th father, Bkejwanong, represented all the Ojibwe people at that pageant, so-called pageant. It was really a council, if you will, an arrangement that said, okay, all the native people, there are about 14 tribes, I think, represented. We are now going to live in peace with the French who are here. But when the representative of Louis XIV, Mr. Saint Lassan, he gave this part of his speech. And I declare that all the peoples inhabiting this wide country, that they now become my vassals, and that other princes and potentates of whatever rank, that they are denied forever seizing upon or settling within these circumjacent seas. Again, this is, we only get one chance at this, guys, talking to the Europeans and the Neo-Europeans. We are now in charge here. If you want to deal with the native people, you got to go through us. Nobody else can mess with us. Okay, the British Proclamation was just mentioned, 1763. And there's much more to it, of course. But it says that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are now connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, the British, are reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds. Again, it's a recognition that this is sovereign territory. British North America, the parts of it that were not ceded or purchased by the British were native territory. It's a recognition. And one of the things that people don't recognize so much is that the American Revolution was based in large part with that statement right there. What do you mean it's Indian territory? It's ours. And of course it led to the revolution. Okay, so they had the revolution, the Americans are victorious over the British, and so what the Americans do is they essentially adopt the language of the British, saying the new U.S. federal government is now the sovereign power in Indian territory. We are going to do all those things the British said they were going to do. Nobody else can mess with these people. So we had the French saying that nobody can mess with them, then the British saying nobody can mess with them, and now we have the Americans saying nobody can mess with them. It's their sovereign territory. And only the Americans in this case have the right to purchase it from them. Okay, the Northwest Ordinance, 1787. It was a process whereby territories could become states of the Union. One of the things that the Americans did not want to do is they didn't want to have colonies because they had a bad taste in their mouth for colonies. So they set out this Northwest Ordinance that kind of laid out the groundwork for how you become a state. And they mentioned, of course, that the native people. The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians, and their land and property shall never be taken without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed. Again, it's a recognition that native people have the sovereign right, and we can't do anything about it unless they agree to all of these things. And when we look back at the papal bulls, it was go in there and kill them all, do whatever you want. But by the time things evolved a little bit, and I'm using that word rather loosely, we find that it's a little bit less violent. We're not going to kill them all necessarily unless we have to, but we'd rather just, quote unquote, purchase their lands from them, get a cession. But still, it's that idea that only one country gets to talk about these things. So when we talk about a border, what is a border? If it's not U.S. territory or British territory, all the border does is say who gets to treat with the Indians. That's all it is. That's all the border is, because they don't have any sovereign rights to this territory. And people talk about, well, what makes you sovereign people? The United Nations said that territorial integrity and political independence, those are the two things. Territorial integrity. When, as was mentioned earlier, Lewis Cass came up to Sault Ste. Marie in 1820 to get a land cession. Did they have any territorial integrity in the Upper Great Lakes? Of course not. They had no sovereignty whatsoever. So when you hear people like George Bush, our former president, saying that we gave them sovereignty, that is, we, the United States, gave the Native people sovereignty, I'm afraid it's exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. We had territorial integrity, we had political independence, and we gave the United States and Canada sovereignty, quote unquote, by ceding land to them. So they had their territorial integrity from us. Something people don't want to talk about very much. So we had the Treaty of Paris. It laid out all of the arguments for where they're going to draw this border between the two countries. And as David mentioned earlier, these in the Upper Great Lakes, throughout the entire Great Lakes, it's never been enacted by legislation. So I think in the 1783 treaty, it was simply, you just go up the middle of the waterway and that's the end of it. And if there's an island, you just go down the middle of the island, you know, who cares? We move on to other parts of like the Jay Treaty, which again should be mentioned, of course, that the official title of it is the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation. How do you navigate those waters? The border has not yet been determined through there. So we have to have another treaty. And of course, the Indians dwelling on either side recognizes that sovereignty once again. There are British citizens, I guess they call them subjects, British subjects, American citizens, and the Indians dwelling on either side of that border. In other words, that political independence and territorial integrity is still intact. Okay, so now we get to the Treaty of Ghent, 1814. Tecumseh has fallen October 5th, 1813. This Article 9, and it was mentioned earlier, of course, we are going to restore to such tribes or nations, respectively, all the possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to previous to such hostilities. In other words, the war was a big fight between the British and the Americans. Obviously, Tecumseh and his warriors were very, very instrumental in all of that. But they didn't have anything to do with writing this treaty. This is an agreement between the U.S. and Great Britain. And I can't remember exactly what article, but there's actually 2 articles. Both sides put the article in there saying we're going to respect the native people. This is just one of the quotes, and I can't remember which one it is, to tell you the truth. So then we get into the treaty era. And these were also mentioned earlier, 1836 treaty, the 1850 treaty in Canada, and the 1855 treaty. I want to stop, well, maybe it's the next slide. Okay. Well, it shows up on that there, but as the treaty commissioners were going up the St. Mary's River trying to decide which nation gets to treat with the native people, again, it's not who gets the territory, it's which side gets to treat with the native people. They couldn't figure it out when they got up to the, what they called Mud Lake, I guess it is. It's Mustang Lake today. So they literally drew, and this is what it's referred to as in the documents, a termination line. They only could go so far. They couldn't just they thought that Neebish Island was going to go to the Americans, but there was still a big fight over Sugar Island. Who gets to treat with the native people over Sugar Island? That's not their interpretation, that's my interpretation. And then the documents also say they called Sugar Island St. George Island. Once you get 1 mile west of St. George Island, then the termination line is placed there, and then they draw the border to the west through the rapids, etc. But the word termination line is exactly the way that they refer to that. So there's this area between Sugar Island, Neebish Island, and the Upper St. Mary's that is not in the treaty. Because the treaty says, I don't know if it's in there, but the treaty says that the native people cede the land following the line is drawn by the Treaty of Ghent commissioners. That's what it says. So the big question is, there was no line beyond those 2 places. So they did not include either of those in that negotiation. So here's the picture of the map. This 1837 map, and as a shameless plug, I hope to get a bunch of these maps over to the Heritage Center so they can sell them all to you. This is a project of the Center for the Study of Indigenous Border Issues. We're trying to raise a few bucks. We're just almost at the break-even point now, I'm happy to say. But you can see on that map, in 1837, this is the same year that Michigan became a state, Sugar Island is shown there as a reservation. So my question is, how could it be a reservation? How could the Americans claim that it's a reservation as part of Michigan when it's not part of the United States even? And it's not like they forgot about that. I don't know if I got the slides in here or not, but I don't know how well you'll be able to see it either, but here's an 1831 map that shows Sugar Island on the other side of the border. Here's another map from 1838, shows Sugar Island on the other side of the border. And I've seen maps, of course, that have it on the U.S. side, etc. In fact, I don't know if I have it in this, but there's one map that's really, really interesting. It's fascinating. It's from the Land Register Office in the United States government that simply shows the border stops and starts. Because that's what it was. That's what it was. In 1836, the border stopped and then it started up again, and everybody knew it. So some of my friends up north referred to this, I'll have to get back to it now. This coloring of this map as a reservation is not a reality, it's a wish. This is a claim by the Americans to the British, even though we haven't drawn the border yet. They tried in 1828 is when they drew that termination line. So 1836, this is a claim by the United States government. We're going to treat with these native people. We just did. So it's ours. So we get to the next treaty. Well, oh, by the way, at the corner of the map, there's this census of the native people in Michigan. Even though Sugar Island is listed in the treaty as a reservation, it is, and it's shown on the map as a reservation, they are not on this census. And I think Schoolcraft is saying to everybody, we didn't put them on the census because they're not part of Michigan. They're not. But they're apparently counted as part of the Sault Ste. Marie band or something. But the point is, all the reservations are listed, all the reservations have the census data, but not Sugar Island. Okay. All right, so you've seen that map already, So it took till 1842 before the commissioners could actually decide which side, the Americans or the British, get to treat with the native people. And it's not just Sugar Island and Neebish Island. There was a whole number of problems that they had on the border. And one of the things that I read, which is kind of interesting, they said of all that, all the different border problems that they had, the only thing of value was Sugar Island. And Helen Tanner in her book had a statement in there about the amount of jam that was taken off of Sugar Island in 1 year. They measured it in tons. Tons of jam in 1 year. And so it was very valuable because of the resources. And Carl would know a hell of a lot more about that stuff than I do, because Garden River and Sugar Island are essentially the same thing, which I'm going to show here in a second. So the point is that they didn't actually determine which side gets to treat with people until 1842. Oh, here's that map from the DC Land Office in 1845. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not. This is the one that shows Sugar Island being plotted out, if you will. Platted, I guess is the word. And I've been to the Chippewa County Register of Deeds and looked back at some of the early ones, and some of the dates are back from 1845. And some of the names are names that are associated with Native people today, like Paymont, who's now, Aaron Paymont's the chair of the Sioux tribe. The Paymont is a little settlement of Paymont on Sugar Island. There's a church settlement, etc. Oh, okay, I guess I'm going back. The border in 1828 ended. Now here's the anomaly. When they were drawing those lines, as Carl referred to them as lines drawn upon the water. See, that's the yellow line is the international border. Sugar Island is to the south, Garden River Reserve is to the north. There's parts of Garden River that are on the, quote, U.S. side of the border today, because the water levels are way down. It's land there. So there's always been a very interesting question. Where is that border? And as David says, it's just a gentle quote. I'm going to use the word gentleman here in kind of loose sense. It's a gentleman's agreement. It can change and has changed repeatedly over time. So when we look back at this whole itinerary, if you will, 1828, there was no border. And literally, that's the word that was indeterminate. 1836, Sugar Island was not part of the U.S. 1836 was not part of Canada. 1842, the arbitration placed that responsibility to treat with the Native people on the American side. Now we get to 1850. Canadians didn't get, or the British didn't get a cession of it either. Why? It was not their right to treat with the Native people, because that right had been given to the Americans by their own agreement. So the British didn't bother with the cession either. It's never been ceded, never. So we get to the 1855 treaty, which I think was also mentioned earlier today. It says in there, and like Carl said, it was essentially an allotment treaty, very early Dawes Act kind of thing, where they were going to break up all the land and give it to various people. And I don't know exactly what the interpretation of this statement is, but there's one clause in the treaty that says that nothing in this treaty will affect, I'm not sure it says the rights, but something like that. Nothing in this treaty will affect the rights of the people of Garden River and Sault Ste. Marie, the Garden River Band and Sault Ste. Marie. It doesn't mention the fact that the Garden River Band is on the north side of that border. This is a U.S. treaty, fully recognizing that there are rights of people at Garden River to whatever it is in that treaty. So again, it's not like this is some kind of new idea that I've come up with and a few other people. This is something that has been recognized by the federal government, the U.S., Canada, British government, since time immemorial and to this day. I'll be honest though, when I talk to this about this with my friends up north, they all say, oh my God, Phil, we got so much trouble dealing with one government, you want us to deal with both of them together? Are you crazy? And so it hasn't really gone much beyond the stage of many of us talking about this unceded status. But it's unceded status. And there are, well, I'll go back to that map. I guess that map. I'm not a golfer, but I suspect that you could shoot a golf ball across the river there, very simple. Can you, Carl? You could just wade across, okay. And before 9/11, there was a tremendous amount of movement of peoples in that area. I mean, for centuries, up to and including until 9/11. Now things are really, really unbelievably strange up there, especially for Native people who have been accustomed for literally hundreds of years just getting in their canoe and just going across back and forth. There was absolutely no problem whatsoever. But things have changed dramatically. Okay, 1 minute, very good, James. One of the things that has happened because of some of this ancient knowledge, if you will, of their family ties, in 2008, there was a summit that the Centers for the Study of Indigenous Border Issues is very much involved in. The 4 tribes, I would call them all tribes, Garden River, Bkejwanong, Sioux Tribe, and Bay Mills, came together. They signed 2 copies of a treaty recognizing those ancient historical and cultural and family ties. Then they got in canoes and they went from Sugar Island to Garden River and they signed 2 more copies. So that was only 2008. It wasn't very long ago. And I think it was 2010 maybe, that there were human remains repatriated from the Smithsonian that came through Sioux Tribe, because they could only deal with federally recognized tribes, but then those remains were taken by canoe across the St. Mary's River, and they were Bkejwanong remains, so they were repatriated to Bkejwanong people. And the last thing I'll mention in that regard is, I think it was in 2010, June 30th, the people at Garden River and Bkejwanong, because of 9/11, were having lots of difficulty getting back and forth across the border because they didn't have the appropriate documentation. So, and I wasn't part of the negotiations, I wasn't there, but from my understanding of it is that eventually Chief Dean Sayers of Bkejwanong said, if we can't go across that border, nobody's going across that border. Because the end of the bridge on the Canadian side is actually Bkejwanong territory. So what they did, and it's the first time in recorded history as far as I can tell, they signed a memorandum of understanding, a memorandum of agreement apparently, that states that Bkejwanong and Garden River and Bay Mills and Sioux Tribe are indigenous nations of North America. That's what it says. And I'm very happy to say that my dissertation, my book that was mentioned, they took all the treaties that I said and said, these are, plus some other ones, these are the things, the documents that we can point to. These are the same people. They're not Canadian Indians, that was the big problem. They're not American Indians, they are indigenous nations of North America. So I know this is a conference about Tecumseh. That's the vision of Tecumseh. We form one nation, the Anishinaabe people. And some of our crazy ideas, unceded Indian territory, Sugar Island, should be the capital of that nation. The Anishinaabe nation. It should be right there. We actually have a building already. It's quote, owned by the state of Michigan right now. It's Governor Osborne's summer home, if you will. It's on Duck Island, which is a little island right next to Sugar Island. And we should just take it over. It's obviously not being used by anything. He's been dead for a long, long time. So we could set up our provisional headquarters on Governor Osborne's former estate. All right, Chinigwich.